when you ask somebody what Zionism is, there are actually multiple answers. And I would kind of sort of parse them down into sort of 5 basic paradigms. The first is a very simple idea that the Jews are a nation. And Zionism means that if you believe in Zionism, you believe the Jews constitute a nation. The second form would be that the Jews form a nation, and they should create such a nation state in Palestine, but only with the permission of the local inhabitants. The third form would be that the Jews are a nation. They should form such a state in Palestine, and they have the right to do so without the permission of the local inhabitants, but they shouldn't use force, and they should treat the people there equally. The fourth kind would be to say that the Jews don't need permission. The most extreme form of Zionism says that only Jews have the right to live in Palestine, and non-Jews shouldn't even be there in the first place. And the ones that are should be expelled. And there are many Jews that have that view. In fact, one of the elements, or one of the parts of the Israeli government prior to this one is a party called Moladeh, which believes that all non-Jews should be expelled from Israel and from Palestine. And so this is the reality of what Zionism is. But in the United States, what is basically portrayed as Zionism is the idea that the Jews are a nation and they should be allowed to constitute a state. But they don't go to the extent of realizing what does this actually mean in practice. And in fact, perceived in that way, it's quite clearly an act of racism to do that. So this disconnect between how Americans see Zionism and how Zionism has actually acted upon the Palestinians, and Muslims are aware of that, is one of the big differences between why Muslims see this conflict in one way and how Americans perceive it in general in another way. Another element that should be kept in mind in terms of the alliance between the United States and Israel is the role of Christian Zionism. Christian Zionism is a very popular, very strong strain among Christians who are evangelicals. And evangelicals form the strongest part of the Bush electoral alliance that put him into office. Evangelical Christians believe in a very complicated theology of what's going to happen towards the end of the world. And one of the elements of that theology is that the Jews would reconstitute Israel within Palestine. And so it is important to them from a theological standpoint that Israel be there, because it is part of the whole world view of how the end of the world is going to come about. And what's curious about this alliance between Christian Zionists and Israelis is that when you take the story further in terms of what Christian Zionists believe will come about, is not only will Israel be created, but eventually the Jews will either become Christians or they will be damned. So it is a curious alliance, but politically useful, and so it is ongoing. A third element is the role of the media in the United States, and the role of the media is basically to whitewash what happens in Israel and Palestine. So the truth about what actually happens to the Palestinians, where the wall is actually being built, because in the minds of most Americans it is a separation between Israeli territory and the Palestinians, when in fact the reality is that the wall is built deeply into large sections of the West Bank, and it's essentially a giant land grab of Palestinian land. Even if you just say that the Palestinians only deserve the West Bank, it's still a giant land grab. The media also has a large number of supporters of Israel within it. So when they pick stories, when they decide what they're going to put on the air, when they decide who they're going to interview, all of those things are affected by their own internal biases. So that's why the stories are the way they are. In addition to that, the media in the United States knows who reads their newspapers. If they write stories that are going to be perceived by major advertisers, major subscribers, vocal groups within the United States as being something they don't like to read, or they don't want to hear about, or they have a lot of problems with, they get a lot of backlash against them. In fact, the LA Times in the past has written pieces that have been critical of Israel, and they've gotten hammered and had subscriptions canceled and been relentlessly attacked for being anti-Semitic or being biased against Israel, these kind of things. So your criticisms may be, the attack that will be leveled against you is that you are merely anti-Semitic and you are basically a junior version of the Nazis. And to do that, to accuse somebody of that, is to discredit them entirely. So Israel can be dismissed by being charged as an anti-Semite. And this is a very, very common technique being used against critics of Israel.
My father was forced with his family, like the rest of the people in the city of Jaffa, when the center of the city became the place to hang and execute the Arab men of Jaffa. Years later, when I asked my father to write about a lifetime journey that I will end up inherit along with my siblings, 2 weeks, he said. That's what the Arab population of Jaffa as it's known now, 45 years living away from home as a refugee until his passing here in Los Angeles in 1997. Palestine became a forbidden word. As I traveled within the Arab world, I was identified as a Palestinian refugee. As I traveled to Europe and to the US to study, I was told Palestine does not exist. To them and to the rest of the world, this is the story of one Palestinian family from among the almost 700,000 families forced into exile in 1948. As Israel celebrated its 60th anniversary, you hardly heard of the other side of the story, AL-NAKBA, the Palestinian catastrophe, the untold story of the Palestinian suffering.
I'm also a Palestinian, and I would have been born in my homeland, Palestine, had it not been for is when forces of the Palmach and Haganah, which had fanned around the town of Ramla, began to attack the outlying villages, and my village is called Jimzu, a very old and ancient town, was attacked the night of July 11, and the resistance, including my father and a couple of uncles, were area of the globe, but this particular area of globe is devoid of people, that is, did not have anybody. The Palestinians did not exist, the Palestinians did not constitute a nation, the Palestinians did not constitute a people, that is, they did not exist, and therefore we can do anything to them that we choose. We Europeans, that is, we whites, we can do anything to these darkies, we can do anything to these Orientals, we can do anything to these Arabs, because they don't constitute anything as we understand what a people are, what a nation is, and what so it is really has to do with land. The whole conflict has to do with land. And equally as the Muslims were, as the Sunnis were, as the Shia were, as the Kurds were, as any other subject of the particular political system. So they were not persecuted because they were Jews. They were persecuted because they were subjects like everybody else. And so this myth that this conflict is from time immemorial is false. It is really has to do with the Zionist movement that came in on the shoulder of imperialist countries, specifically England, that gave them buy the land and we will take away the Palestinian from that land. And with collusion between the colonial administration and the Zionist movement and the Jewish agency, they were able to bring